Disclaimer: J.K. Rowling wins gold for creating a character as creepily evil as Bellatrix Lestrange, although Helena Bonham Carter deserves some credit too. Hermione was jolted back to awareness when she was dumped onto a marble floor, bruised and aching. She hadn't really processed what was going on, only that the team had been chased out of the manor and she'd somehow wound up dueling Rookwood, who'd hit her with a curse she didn't recognize. Her right leg was still locked in the contracted position, unable to move and burning from the prolonged exertion. Her left leg was painfully stiff. She looked around. The lamps were lit and she was lying in a room full of ornate furniture. From Dobby's description, she was pretty sure this was the drawing room. There were groans and heavy footsteps around her. She turned her head side to side and saw 3 red-headed boys lying on the floor, with Death Eaters standing around them. Bill was tied up, and George and Ron had their hands bound. Hermione's hands were free, somehow. She reached for her holdout wand with one hand while trying to push herself up with the other when she was forced back down by a slim black shoe on her shoulder. "Bellatrix!" she hissed. She tried to bring her holdout wand around to point at her, but Bellatrix was faster. She grabbed Hermione's wrist and pulled it back till it nearly snapped, and she dropped the wand. Bellatrix said, as if she were scolding a naughty child. "Can't have you doing that, dearie." She straddled Hermione's waist and cast a spell that stuck her wrists to the floor as if they were magnets. She picked up the holdout wand and waved it, then laughed when nothing happened. "Ha! Are you really so desperate that you're carrying a wand that doesn't work?" She snapped it in two and tossed it aside, and it landed next to a pile of their other, thankfully intact, wands. Too far to reach. Hermione said nothing, doing her best to murder Bellatrix with her eyes. Of course, the blood-bound wand would be dead in anyone's hands but her own. She felt a sudden probing at her mind. She blocked it out fast with occlumency, but even as she did, a sudden stab of panic struck her. If she legitimized George or Ron, she might be able to dig up something about the Horcruxes. They hadn't expected to be caught so near the front lines. "So you are as smart as they say," Bellatrix said. "You can close your mind, but let's see what else you're carrying." Still straddling Hermione, she began patting her down from head to toe in a most uncomfortable fashion. It was then that she realized that she had already been divested of her basilisk skin coat and her expanded handbag. "Hey!" George coughed. "Hey, you get your hands off my girlfriend, you—" "Crucio!" "Ah!" "George, no!" Hermione screamed. "George, stop!" His brothers struggled as well, but each of them found themselves covered by a Death Eater. Bellatrix, Lucius, Rookwood, and Pettigrew. 3 guests in the manor. More than they'd bargained for, obviously. Narcissa was standing in the back of the room, looking nervous. Hermione saw she was pregnant. That was new. The Order hadn't heard much about her in the past year. Had that influenced the Death Eater's response? It didn't much matter when they had no wands between them. "Aha!" Bellatrix said, finally climbing off of her. The only thing left on Hermione's person worth taking was her stiletto. "Not bad. So what do we have here? Undesirable number 2 in the flesh, plus lover boy. Isn't that sweet? And a curse breaker and—" She stared down at Ron. "What do you actually do again?" Ron snarled at her. "Screw you, bitch. I'm running this show." "Ah!" "Crucio, learn some manners, boy," Bellatrix snapped. "Ron, stop it!" Their shouts fell on deaf ears. Where was Dobby? Hermione didn't see him. He might be hiding somewhere, or he might possibly be trapped outside the wards somehow. It was hard to be sure what they could do. Either way, Hermione didn't dare call him when he'd pop directly into a crossfire. Bellatrix knelt beside Hermione, her grinning face looming above her. "So, what are all of you doing here?" she asked. "Seriously?" Hermione thought. "Freeing the prisoners. What else would we be doing?" "Oh, no plans to burn down the house, kill some Death Eaters, ambush the Dark Lord?" "No, we weren't expecting to be seen." "How did you get in?" That was Lucius. Hermione turned her head and got a look at his face. He didn't look as prim and haughty as he had before. A brief stint in Azkaban, the disgrace of failing you-know-who at the Department of Mysteries, and the loss of his son hadn't done him any favors. The silk bathrobe he wore somehow made him look both more and less refined at the same time. Hermione chuckled in spite of herself at Lucius's question. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she said, and that was the absolute truth. She'd barely been able to convince Bill it would work. "Insolent mudblood!" Lucius snarled. He raised his cane and cracked against her ribs, making her wince. "Do some fancy tricks with numbers, and you think you're better than the real wizards. Whatever it is, it won't fool Rookwood." He pointed to the graying, curly-haired man in a high-collared robe who was standing over Ron and George. "How did you get into my manor?" She coughed and glared up at him. "Your ward stones are out of alignment," she said, knowing he wouldn't believe her. "Impossible! These are the finest wards in Britain." Hermione took a gamble and said, "Check them yourself." They might find the flaw, but it would take time to fix, and longer to understand how it affected the national network. Lucius didn't bite. He narrowed his eyes and stared down at her, then moved over to Rookwood. "A trick, no doubt. Rookwood, check her bag." Hermione's expanded handbag was tossed near their wands. Rookwood opened it and started pulling everything out. Pettigrew moved from the immobile to cover George, looking as shifty as ever. Ron choked. "No," he groaned. "Hermione?" She shook her head. "I took everything important out of it," she said. "I'm not stupid." Everything irreplaceable or that she couldn't allow into enemy hands, although some things in it were still valuable to them. She winced as Rookwood pulled her cell's last 2 broomsticks out and threw them aside. Brooms," he muttered. "Textbooks, both magical and muggle it seems, but nothing out of the ordinary. Clothing, male and female, some healing potions, a bag of charcoal, odd. Tea kettle, quills and parchment, muggle pens and paper, telescope, omnoculars, potion ingredients, gloves, cauldron, some other bits and bobs, and, interesting, a magical tent. It looks like you planned for quite a lot, Granger. Pity you won't be able to take it with you." He turned back to Lucius. "No clues there. She's right. She didn't leave anything valuable." "Check the others," Lucius replied. Hermione craned her neck to watch as Rookwood patted down Bill. Unfortunately, Bill did have one piece of incriminating material on him. His notes for how to break through the wards. She didn't know what all was on it, but it must have had some background about continental drift and ley line misalignment. Whatever it was, Rookwood seemed to notice because he froze and slowly rose to his feet. "Bellatrix?" he said softly. "What?" She moved closer to him. He showed her the parchment and whispered something to her while pointing at Hermione. Bellatrix's eyes grew wide and mad when she heard it, showing white all around, and her face paled. She swooped down on Hermione, planting a knee on her chest and holding the page over her face. "What is this?" she hissed. "What is this, Mudblood?" It was the ley line map of Britain, with the distortions to the lines marked. "What? That?" Hermione choked out, confused. "It's a ley line map." "Hey!" Bill yelled. "That's mine! She had nothing to do with—" "Crucio!" Bellatrix yelled, and Bill screamed in agony. "You think I'm an idiot blood traitor? This has her written all over it. Lucius, toss those 3 in the cellar." She pointed to all 3 of the Weasley boys. "I'll deal with them later." Lucius drew himself up and stepped nearly nose to nose with her. "Excuse me, Bellatrix, but this is my house, and—" "And I have been given explicit instructions from the Dark Lord himself," she hissed, waving the parchment in his face. "If the Mudbloods got this far, we have a serious problem." What was she talking about? Did you know who know about continental drift, too? The war would have started already by the time he could have. There wouldn't be much opportunity, and it didn't sound like him. "No, stop it! Don't! Hermione! George!" she cried as Lucius and Rookwood manhandled the boys and threw them down the stairs beneath the trapdoor, sealing it over their heads. Hermione could hear shouts of pain and desperation faintly from below. For herself, she still couldn't move, her wrists pinned to the marble. She groaned when Bellatrix again knelt on her chest, so hard that she winced as she thought she might have felt a rib crack. "What are you doing with that map?" Bellatrix demanded. Hermione furrowed her brow. "What?" "This map!" she yelled in her face. "What were you doing with it?" "It's how we got in." "Liar!" The pressure on Hermione's chest increased. "This isn't the manor. What do the numbers mean?"
They're runestone misalignments.
She gave up holding back. They'd freed the prisoners. This small advantage was a lot less important than getting out of here.
I told you the wardstones are misaligned.
Bellatrix narrowed her eyes and looked back and forth between her and the paper.
150 feet?
It was yards, not feet, but Hermione didn't correct her. She coughed and choked under her weight.
Please, she groaned, that's not impossible. It takes a surveyor's square to see it, but...
That was apparently the wrong thing to say, as Bellatrix grew paler and even more manic.
Where have you been?
She hissed.
What?
Hermione tried to flinch away. What had she said?
Where have you been? Narborough, Fringard, Highward, Lineham, North Curry. Where did you measure from? Nowhere. I didn't measure it. I calculated it. Crucio!
Hermione was blinded with pain. It shot through her body from head to toe, burning everything. She felt it in her muscles, organs and bones like 1,000 knives stabbing into her all at once. But even that paled next to the searing agony that ravaged her, as every inch of her skin, inside and out, felt like she'd been doused in boiling oil and set on fire. Her mucous membranes all the way into her lungs were burning with a pain she'd never known before. She screamed like she never had before, but she could barely hear it as she felt daggers stabbing in her ears. Her head felt like someone was taking a rack of drills to it. This was hell. All sense of time and coherent thought fled from her until she couldn't imagine anything but the pain. She didn't know how long she was under it when she came out of it. It might have been seconds or minutes. It couldn't have been longer because she would have fainted from exhaustion even if her mind came through intact. But it felt like hours. And like no time at all. So intense that part of her felt like it couldn't have been real when she wasn't under it. And yet the pain lingered. Not just the scrapes and bruises from her thrashing on the floor. Not just the deep ache of strained muscles and bones from her convulsions. The pain of being burnt all over lingered, an echo of the crushing, inhuman force of the unforgivable curse. How had Harry been able to stand after this? Much less fight? She could barely hear as the ringing in her ears subsided. Rookwood was speaking. Wasn't always accurate. If the larger grid is misaligned, it could be possible to find a weak point. Hermione only half listened. She strained her ears and caught the faint sound of George shouting her name from the dungeon.
I see. You, no lies, Mudblood.
Bellatrix hissed hatefully. Her eyes struggled to focus on the woman's face.
If you're so sure the stones are misaligned, how did you measure them?
Hermione opened her mouth, but her voice caught. Her throat was already feeling raw from her screams.
I didn't need to, she managed. Only needed the age. Drift over time. Stones drift? Is that the best you can think of? No, of course, you're bluffing. That's it. You came for Rookwood. Lure him into a trap with some ridiculous story. What?
Hermione was lost. Bellatrix was making less and less sense by the minute.
Rookwood? We didn't know he was here. We were hoping he wasn't. Crucio!
Hermione's body seized up, and she thrashed on the floor as the fire consumed her again. She screamed, but she couldn't even feel how it tore at her throat, the pain was so bad. It seemed to burn worse than before, and to last longer, but either of those things could have been in her head. It was too much for her mind to process as anything less. She gasped as the curse was lifted. Her throat hurt worse, and she felt like she sprained her arm with her thrashing. Her body felt the aftermath of being burned, hypersensitive to any painful stimulus. Her heart felt like it would leap out of her chest in her rising panic. What was going on? Was this happening? She squealed when Bellatrix grabbed her by the throat.
You knew Rookwood was here, she said. You want what he knows. No.
Slam! Bellatrix cracked her head against the ground, making her see stars.
Yes, his spells, knowledge, but not here. Can't fight him. Trying to free prisoners, wanted house empty. You needed him to finish your map, didn't you? You couldn't find what you needed, so you tried to get him. Where have you been looking?
Hermione shook her head fiercely, weeping.
Please, I don't know what you're talking about. Eek!
Bellatrix grabbed her by the hair and forced her head back.
How did you know about Highworth? She demanded. Lineham! It's basic geomancy, please! Where were you surveying? I swear we didn't! I calculated the movement of Crucio! She screamed again as indescribable agony seared her to the bone. It never varied. Would be counterproductive if it did, because the only way it could vary was to be less. The maximum degree of pain that the nervous system was physically capable of transmitting. A limit as immutable as absolute zero. A torture she couldn't escape, no matter how she screamed and flailed and tore at her own body. She tasted blood in her mouth when the curse cut off. She didn't wait for a question and shouted as fast as she could. The continents move over time! I swear that's not a lie! Ask any muggle! Look in the library! They move under the ley lines and the runestones behind them! Ah! Crucio! She couldn't do it. She had no idea what Bellatrix was talking about. She couldn't think for long enough to string two thoughts together with the Cruciatus curse burning into her. She'd say anything to stop her, but she didn't know what she wanted to hear. "You're with Potter, aren't you?" Bellatrix said. "Where's he? He didn't feel like coming? Was this a distraction?" He's not coming out," Hermione wheezed. "Learnt that last time." "Does he know about this? Does he know where you've been?" She couldn't even evaluate which answer was right or wrong, either strategically or in Bellatrix's twisted head. She hadn't tried legilimency again, which was good because Hermione couldn't imagine how occlumency could stand up to this. "He knows everything," she said. "Then where is he, Mudblood? What rotten hole is he hiding in?" "Can't say. Fidelis," she said, praying she would buy it. No dice. "Crucio! Ah!" "Hermione! No, let her go!" "Take me instead!" The muffled sounds continued coming from the cellar, now accompanied by pounding on the trapdoor. They must have escaped their bonds somehow, but it wasn't helping to get them out. Lucius looked nervous, or at least Hermione thought he did. She could barely see straight. Bellatrix seemed unconcerned, however. "You're lying, filthy Mudblood! I know your type. Uppity bitch who has to know everything. You wouldn't leave that to someone else." She shook her head violently. "Harry doesn't trust anyone after Pettigrew. Ah! Crucio!" It was probably only 2 seconds at most, since Bellatrix didn't break her cadence, but 2 seconds felt like 20 when she was in that much pain. "Or maybe you're right and he is keeping, but where do you get your food?" Bellatrix said. "You can't hide that secret." Hermione's eyes widened. How could she have missed such an obvious flaw? Sure, she'd known going to the store was a risk, but she never thought of it as revealing part of the secret. "Ha! You didn't think of that, did you, Mudblood? Where—" "Apparate!" she cried. "We apparate to the store! Different town!" A lie, but there was apparition involved. "Crucio!" Bellatrix cursed her. A second or two, again. "You didn't think that far ahead, Mudblood. I can see it in your eyes. Maybe we'll just keep you here. Potter has to come out of his hole eventually. We just need to know what town it is. We know it's a town. You need the equipment for that little radio show of yours. Has to be centrally located to reach the whole country." "Did it?" She shook her head. "Broadcast through the ley lines. Can do it from anywhere." "Where are you staying? Is that how you found these circles?" "No, not on a major line. Staying away from those. I swear we've never been there. Crucio! Ah!" Hermione turned her head and vomited, vaguely surprised that she'd managed not to before. Bellatrix leapt up and backed away, but she carefully came around again the other side and grabbed her by the chin again. "Check the books again, Rookwood," Bellatrix ordered. "See if there's any clues to where she's been written in them." "What?" That didn't make any sense. Could be," Rookwood said. He picked up one of the textbooks and leafed through it. What was he expecting to find? She had bought a couple of the books at the used bookshop in Nottingham, but that wouldn't tell him where they were, and most of them she hadn't anyway. "Listen carefully, Mudblood," Bellatrix whispered, grabbing her attention again. She forced her head to the side and smeared her hair in the mess. "I don't care what dragon dung story you want to tell about moving continents, or what have you, but you can't draw a ley line map that accurate without surveying. Too many of the locations are unplottable. Now where did you do it?" Her voice rose to a screech. "It's a geometric figure on the earth," Hermione sobbed. We've never been to any of those towns. Crucio! Ah! Which ones did you visit? Was it North Curry? Fringford? What were you looking for? I swear we never went to any of them. She strained her neck to see the man standing behind her. Rookwood, please, tell her. Tell her you can calculate the coordinates arithmetically. She begged the Death Eater in her delirium. Rookwood stood silent as stone, still looking at the books. Please, Rookwood! Crucio! Ah! We weren't looking for anything. We only wanted to get in here. We didn't know you were here. We didn't know he was here. Crucio! I know you're lying, Mudblood. What were you looking for at the intersections? Nothing, please. There was nothing. We only wanted to help Luna. Crucio! Hermione's screams were ragged and hoarse. She felt the curse shoot through her, the curse that had robbed Septima of her numeracy, that had robbed Neville's parents of their minds. Had they felt like this? Tortured for answers they didn't have, to questions they didn't understand, helpless as they were slowly lobotomized? How long had it taken? Hours? A day? How long before the damage was permanent? How long before she lost her voice from the screaming and couldn't answer, even if she wanted to?
She lost all track of time, even when she wasn't being cursed. At some point, she didn't know if she'd been there half an hour or a week. All she knew was the pain, the fire seeping into her brain. Bellatrix kept grilling her, asking more and more insistently what they were looking for down south, but she couldn't give an answer. Magic crackled around her fingertips. Accidental magic? With the stress, she could feel it, wanted to use it to do something, anything to make the pain stop. She lost the feeling every time the curse racked her body. It was useless. Neville's parents hadn't managed it. They'd had a baby with them and would have fought with everything they had. Would it have mattered that they'd had 4 maniacal Death Eaters torturing them and not one? Crucio! Her scream was little more than a gagging sound. Her hands and feet were going numb. How did you find it? How did you find the circles? Rookwood, please tell her, she babbled, her voice scratching. You're an arithmancer, you know this. Spheroidal trigonometry, the mirror planes of the dodecahedron. We could do it anywhere, from France, from America. Crucio! What did you find there? Tell me the truth or I swear I'll run you through with this knife. She couldn't speak. Her tongue wouldn't obey. Crucio, tell me! Please, just... Bellatrix pulled her chin again to face her. Hermione stared blankly into her eyes. Hermione! Hermione! George's voice came through. Do something! I can't hear her! Hermione grunted as Bellatrix straddled her again, knocking the wind out of her. Let's try something a little more hands-on, shall we? She said in her fake sweet voice. She flashed her knife again, but she didn't run Hermione through. Instead, she practically lay across her chest and reached towards her exposed left arm. She cut the sleeve off her robe and then started cutting into her flesh. Hermione whined under the assault. She couldn't see, but she could feel the cuts. 4 strokes in a zigzag pattern, then a curve, and she knew what word Bellatrix was carving. Where she was about to give up and let go, a spark of anger seized her. In rage and pain and desperation at the absolute limit of her endurance, she pushed, struggling to hold it. Her body wouldn't obey, but she pushed harder, pushing into that feeling of magic that children usually tried to suppress. Bellatrix carved the 8th letter, and then rose to her feet to admire her handiwork. Feeling more talkative now? She said, pointing her wand. Wake up, Mudblood! Crack! Hermione's arm ripped up from the floor, and a bolt of blue lightning shot from her fingertips, hitting her square in the chest. Bellatrix went sprawling across the floor as it continued to crackle over her body for several seconds in a way any Muggle-born would recognize. At the same moment, Hermione reached out and pulled, and her vinewood wand flew into her hand. She completed half the motion of bringing it up like a sword before she caught herself. This wasn't a movie. 4 on 1. She had a second at most. She pointed her wand and cast a single spell. Ron and his brothers pounded on the trap door above their head without effect. Hermione's screams had grown ever more ragged and desperate as Bellatrix tortured her about things that didn't even make sense. Ron was sure the sound of her screams would haunt his nightmares, and George was even worse off. He'd heard fingers break with the constant pounding and scratching and felt his own fingers bleed. It was so awful, he didn't think anything could be more horrible than the sound of her screams, until he heard them stop. Then they came back, but different, a high-pitched whine. What was happening to her?
"Feeling more talkative now?" Bellatrix's voice came through. "Wake up, Mudblood! Cruci—" Crack!
Ron jumped as he heard a new sound, one that he didn't recognize, but which sounded vaguely like lightning. George spoke.
"What was that?"
Bang! Ron stared as the trapdoor was ripped off its hinges and flew upward above their heads. Ron's head popped up just in time to take in the whole scene in an instant. Bellatrix was sprawling on the floor, and lightning was crackling over her body. Lucius and Rookwood were stunned by the sudden explosion. And Hermione was lying on her stomach with her wand pointed towards them. While he was looking, there was another bang as the trapdoor hit the ceiling, and Ron's keen tactical mind sprang into action. Without consciously thinking about it, he ducked and covered his head with his arm even as he bounded up the stairs. The chunk of the door crashed down on him, but he fought through the pain and leaned into it.
"Dobby, now!"
someone said. It must have been Hermione. She should have shouted it, but it came out as more of a croak. Ron moved. His wand was broken. Bill couldn't walk, and Hermione was surrounded, so he grabbed the edge of the piece of wood and barreled towards the greatest threat, Rookwood. A curse from Rookwood shattered the door, but Ron's momentum knocked him to the ground. Ron grabbed for his wand and elbowed him in the jaw. Rookwood may have been a brilliant unspeakable, but he was getting old, and Ron had Quidditch reflexes and 5 older brothers to fight with. Then, so many things happened at once that he couldn't keep track of it all. George ran for Hermione, and he dove to avoid curses from Lucius and Pettigrew. The chandelier overhead crashed down with no warning, and glass shards scattered everywhere. Lucius reeled back in shock as they cut into his face. Ron wrested Rookwood's wand away from him and cast a bludgeoning curse at Lucius. Dobby threw a knife at Bellatrix. Where had he come from?
"Bill!"
George yelled. He tossed Bill's wand down the stairs. Was Bill still down there? Rookwood grabbed for his wand back, clutching Ron's wrist like a vice. Bill started to pop up, but Rookwood twisted around and shot a curse at him, knocking him back down the stairs with a muffled shout. Ron used his other arm and elbowed Rookwood in the bollocks. He flinched, and Ron wrested the wand away again and stunned him. Ron started to rise, then ducked as a curse from Pettigrew flew over his head. He cursed back, but the rat was bloody quick and kept dodging. Ron dove for cover, and they danced around each other, curses flying, until Bill crawled back up and managed to hit Pettigrew with a stunner from the floor. Bellatrix was fighting George, Hermione, and Dobby all at once, her curses smashing against their shields and deflecting whatever it was Dobby was doing. They were at a stalemate. Ron started towards them, but then...
"Sissy, kill them!"
Bellatrix shrieked. Ron whirled around and pointed his wand at the only other Death Eater still standing, Narcissa, who froze in mid-step, her wand out. "Don't," he said as threateningly as he could. "I'll do it, I swear I will."
"He's bluffing, Sissy," Bellatrix said. "He's too noble Gryffindor to hex a pregnant witch."
Narcissa hesitated, then started to advance. Ron backed up against the wall and threw up a shield between her and himself and the others. Damn it, could he do it? He didn't think he could. Bellatrix was right. But he had an idea. It was a gambit, a double gambit, but it just might work. "Hermione!" he called. She turned her head, and he waved his wand, trusting her to understand the motion. Her eyes widened, and he didn't hesitate. Accio! Hermione raised a wider shield around herself as she was pulled across the room. Ron jumped and was pulled in her direction himself. He spun her around his body so that she skittered into the wall behind him. She might have fallen, but his first gambit paid off. She held up her shield with one hand and pointed her other wand at Narcissa. Ron ducked and rolled to avoid a curse from Bellatrix, and George and Dobby moved to cover him. Bill was still advancing on his knees, using a piece of the trapdoor as a shield. And Hermione? She was unsteady on her feet, leaning on the wall for support. Her hands shook as she pointed her wand. Her voice was so hoarse she could hardly project it, but Narcissa froze in her tracks.
"Don't make me do it," Hermione rasped out. "Drop your wand."
She dropped it.
"No!"
Bellatrix screamed. She moved faster than ever and did what she hadn't done the whole time. She touched her wand to her dark mark. "Bollocks! Run!" George yelled. Bellatrix fought two-handed to stop them, not with a second wand, but she threw one of her knives at George and a second at Bill while she tried to curse everyone in sight. She swiped a purple curse at Ron that was so powerful that it felt like a whip striking his face, even through his shield. Then she set a fire that burned all the way around the perimeter of the room instantly. But then Dobby disarmed her, and as she stared in shock, George threw a blasting curse at her. It hit so close that she fell to the floor, stunned. Hermione cast 2 spells that blew out part of the front wall of the drawing room with a sound of thunder, making a gap in the flames wide enough to run through. She started trying to run, staggering along, taking just enough time to summon her basilisk skin coat.
Dobby, apparate Bill to the edge of the wards, then drag him through and apparate him to Molly and Arthur,
she said. Ron and George didn't argue. Bill couldn't walk, the rest of them could. They ran after her. George caught up with her and pulled her along, helping to support her. They probably had seconds before you-know-who would be there. They ran flat out to the edge of the wards. When they got a fair distance away, Ron looked over his shoulder and saw Narcissa running after them, wand out, but she wasn't trying to curse them. She looked terrified. It probably wouldn't be good for her health for you-know-who to find her the only one still conscious in this situation. George and Hermione reached to the edge of the wards, with Ron following close behind. "Go!" he yelled, and George apparated Hermione away. Ron looked back one more time. Narcissa was still running, out of breath and stumbling in her maternity robes. "Damn it!" he muttered. "Accio!" Narcissa flew towards him as he pulled her outside the wards. He held his stance to catch her as gently as he could, then promptly dropped her on her arse and apparated away. He landed in a heap with George and Hermione, who had collapsed on the ground. They were at the edge of the wards of Pruitt Manor, just inside the Fidelis charm. He was a little surprised they were there with him, and not back at the factory. Bill was lying a short distance away. "You okay?" he panted.
No,
Hermione said. "She needs healing," George said. "So does Bill." "So do you," Ron said. He looked down at his bleeding hands. "So do I. Come on." He cast Mobile Corpus on Bill and started levitating him towards the manor. George helped Hermione to her feet, and they started after him. He saw his parents run out of the manor, calling their names, followed by Ginny and Percy.
Bill, Hermione,
Mum cried as she reached them.
"What happened?" "George, are you okay?"
Percy demanded. "They caught us," George said. "We barely got away. Hermione..." He choked and couldn't finish the sentence.
"What was it?"
Ginny demanded. Cruciatus, Ron said, and everyone gasped. "It was bad, really bad. Bellatrix won her about I don't know what the hell, and she just wouldn't stop. Damn it, it's all my fault." "It wasn't your fault, Ron," George growled. "Much as I'd like it to be," he added under his breath. "It was my bloody plan that got us caught," Ron said morosely.
"It wasn't," Hermione wheezed. "If we'd known Narcissa was pregnant, if she hadn't come down with some craving just then, you got us out, Ron. We were facing superior firepower, but you figured out how to beat them."
"Barely," he said. They reached the house, and Fleur stepped outside. Her eyes widened as she ran down the front steps, cradling her belly.
"Bill!" she cried as she hurried to her side. "What happened to him?"
"Broken leg, knocked down the stairs, maybe cursed, not sure," Ron said.
"Quickly now," Mum cut in. "Let's get him in the house. He needs help."
Hermione just stared as Mum and Dad carried Bill into the house and laid him on the sofa. Then she stared at Fleur for a few seconds as she doted on her husband, then looked back to Ron.
"Ron, how did you know?"
she asked softly. "Huh?"
"How did you know I'd do it, that I'd curse Narcissa?"
"I didn't," he said. "But I knew she'd think you would." Hermione opened her mouth to respond, but just then Fleur let out an inhuman screech.
"Aye, Bill, Molly!" "Fleur, what is it?" Mum gasped.
Fleur leaned into the sofa and clutched at her stomach.
"Oh, Molly, a Zinxie baby is coming!"
"What?" Bill groaned.
"Oh, Merlin's bollocks!"
Ron stared in shock. That was Mum. George and Ginny froze. Hermione fell over.
"That's impossible," Ron said. "You've got like 6 weeks left." "Aye, tell her that," Fleur snapped. Okay, no need to panic," Mum said, taking charge. "Arthur, fetch a tub of water. You know what to do. Ginny, help me. George, do what you need to for Hermione. Percy, look over Bill, and if anyone can call for help..." "The hospital," Hermione said. "St. Mungo's."
Dad shook his head.
"It's no good. They'd find us." "But the healers," she protested.
Fleur screamed, and Bill sat up and struggled to reach out to her from the sofa. "Our oath bound to protect us," Dad said, "but the Death Eaters who will surely be watching the building aren't. We have to do it here."